Hi everybody, my name is Paul Smyers. I'm a real estate agent in the beautiful Shenandoah Valley, Virginia. I work for Alliance Team Realty in Moneta. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about outbuildings. I'm a specialist in rural property, and when you buy a rural property, having an outbuilding of some kind on your property adds a lot of value. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. In the rural areas, a lot of the people who are contractors, electricians, and so on, have a business that's located and centralized on their own property. And these kind of people who have construction equipment and various kinds of tools, they need a shed or storage or something. And that's typically what you'll find. Even on a mobile home, I have seen a pretty nice garage, a pretty nice shed, or some fencing and so on, even on a property that has a mobile home on its own land. And that adds a lot of value that is underestimated, because today when people build a house, let's say somebody buys some land and they build a house, and a suburban type of house there, but it doesn't have any outbuildings, just no shed, no garage, nothing. So the strange thing is that some of those properties sell for a lot of money. You're talking about $400,000 or $500,000 for a house. There's no shed. I know a person in my family who has a large house and a 3-car garage, and it does have a 3-car garage, but it's full of stuff, and there's no other shed. There's no place to store things. So what happens is people have stuff, they put it in the garage, and it just accumulates and everything. If you have an outbuilding of some kind, it really makes a big difference, and you'll find that a lot of times in older properties in rural areas. For example, where I live, I have a number of outbuildings here. I have an office that I'm in now. I have an outhouse, which I don't really care about, but I use that for the hip campers. And I have a big, huge pole barn that has a large, high ceiling and everything. You can park a couple RVs in there or whatever. I have my work shop in there. I have a lot of woodworking tools and so on, my welder. And then I also have a 1,000 square foot concrete floor workshop that has some other things on and some storage and so on. So all those buildings on my site here have extra value that when you buy a house, you may not really appreciate what it takes, because when you buy a house, let's say you buy a house and it has nothing. You get a shed, you can get a shed. There's lots of opportunities now and places you can buy sheds and have them delivered. But they're typically going to be about $10,000, $12,000. And then you got to prepare it, you got to put some gravel down there, or maybe even a concrete pad or something, and put your shed there. And then a lot of times they're bare bones, nothing's in there, you got to insulate them or something. So what I'm saying is that when you look for a property in a rural area, see if you can find something that has some extras, some fencing, a garden. It could be anything, just some kind of accessory building that you can use for storage, for your tools, for your gardening, for your hobbies, even for your office. And I talk about that a lot of times in some of my other videos when you look for rural property. So what can we look for? Well, in the rural areas, you're going to see a lot of older barns and so on. A lot of times a farm will sell, a small farm, and they will have some buildings there, but they're old. They may be like 50, 60, or even 100 years old, and they're starting to rot. You see those barns that are falling down. Now, if it's in decent shape, and that means its foundation, in other words, it can have like a little bit of wear and tear on it, but as long as the foundation is good and the structure is basically good, that can add a lot of value to your purchase. It's really hard to evaluate. When I look at property, and whether it's a listing side or a buyer side, I have to kind of get a rough estimate of what would it cost to build that structure again. How much is a square foot per construction on a house, for example? In our area, it can range from $150 a square foot way up there. I've seen some real high numbers. And when you look on Zillow and it says here they have a square footage amount, price per square foot, it can be very deceptive because they figure in the land also in the price, and they just divide the square foot of the house. And if it's a 20-acre parcel, and it's basically they're evaluating the whole house and property based on square footage, that can be a real high number. So what I have to do is I have to look at let's say a basic home on a property, let's say it's a 2-acre zoning. A house on 2 acres has a septic and well, typically, that's 1 unit. Then if you go beyond 2 acres, let's say it's 2-acre zoning, and it has like 10 acres, well now you got a whole other thing going on. You got 8 more acres that you have to evaluate. And the price per acre of rural land can range very widely. It can go $10,000, $12,000, $15,000 an acre or even more. Some of these high-end building lots are very expensive, $100,000 for a couple acres. On the other hand, raw wooded land, I just did an estimate on listing for that one, a 50-acre parcel, and you know, it's raw wooded land, difficult, 200 feet road frontage, and no road going in, no well, no nothing. So, you know, it comes out to maybe 3,000 an acre if you're lucky. You see, but good farmland with pasture and good soil and everything might be $10,000, $12,000 an acre, you see, even for a large parcel. So when you evaluate a property that you're going to think about buying or even selling, do some math in your mind a little bit about what it really costs. If you're a seller side, you can't just say that, hey, my friend over there a couple of miles down the road sold his house for $250 and therefore mine's worth $250 or maybe it's $450. But not necessarily. What if your property has a whole bunch of extra features? And one thing that's an extra on a property, we'll get into that in another video, but a swimming pool, you know, that may or may not be a good thing to have on your property. We'll talk about that in another video. But if you have a storage building, if you have a garage, especially if you have a heated garage that's well insulated, I came across a property, we were bidding on it for a customer, we ended up losing it, but this place had a 3-bay insulated concrete floor, workshop building combination garage with a generator in there and a air compressor and everything. And you know, I started figuring that out. It's going to cost like $75,000 just to build that, let alone the house, and there's some other structures on the property, you see. And this can be a very difficult process because I had to go in, for example, on an estimate on one property I was looking at, and they had actually on this property a nice house, but in addition they had an actual workshop for, it had worked on cars for 40 years. I mean, it had a lift and everything, a concrete floor. And I went online and started thinking, well, try to get an estimate, well, what does it cost to build that? You see, that the property was listed at $350,000. And I figured the house, it had 3.5 acres of land plus some extra available from the same seller. So you figure the house by itself could easily be worth over $300,000 because it was a nice house, well maintained, 1 or 2 owners at the most, and it was a great house. It had a clean, large basement that wasn't even quite finished, but easily finished. And then I had this workshop on there. Now, my client didn't actually bid on this particular property because they didn't really want that workshop. But again, it had a whole lift for working on cars and everything. So it probably had a compressor in there and all kinds of heavy-duty electrical systems. So what I'm getting at is when you look at your property, if you're looking for real property in a rural area, you're very likely to find some other structures on a homestead. If it's a homestead of 2 or 3 acres, always consider the value and what you can do with it. Let's say, for example, that property that had a workshop on it with a car lift on it. If you're a mechanic or you work on Harleys or something, I mean, that's a gold mine. You say, man, I got myself a workshop. Who's going to build that for me for less than a couple $100,000? You see? But not everybody wants that. And some people say, well, I'd like the house, but I don't really need that big workshop, you see. So, but you might be the person who just says, okay, for example, horse property. Very common in rural areas. People really look for property where they can have horses. It has to be zoned right and everything else. And preferably with some fencing. But you can find horse property that doesn't really, it's technically allowed horses, but it doesn't really have any place to graze, it's just wooded. I mean, so if you're willing to hire somebody or cut down some trees or make a clearing in your property, that's good. But if it's already done for you, and someone else done it and it's already got 1,000 square feet of workshop or 1,000 feet of fencing, that's gold. You see, it costs a lot of money to build 1,000 feet of fencing. So look for those kind of options on property that you're looking for. And again, water is really important. We talk about that in some of my other videos. You got to find water on your property. And I came across a property the other day. I looked at it, and it was a wooded area. And frankly, if they ever had to dig a well on that property, it would be very expensive. They would have to go way down. So technically speaking, that property didn't really have good water access. And it may look good at 50 acres at a nice attractive price, but what can you do with it, you see? And that's the kind of thing that you have to think about when you get into real property. Again, driveways can be valuable. It costs a lot of money to pave. If you got a steep gravel driveway, it's likely to get rain runoff and wear out. So think about the costs of certain possibilities that may happen. Like say if you have an old barn and okay, it's fine for a couple of years, but then you got to tear it down and you can sell the wood sometimes. But if you have structures that are in good condition, like the ones on my property here, they're modern ones. They're not built like 100 years ago with old wood that's rotting. See, so think about the value of the property that you're buying and consider many aspects of the value, not just the square foot of the finished square footage inside the house. Because a homestead in a rural property tends to be a unit that is inclusive of a number of different things, your chicken coops and all that stuff. So again, I think it's very important to start considering some of these things when you look for real property. And I try to be helpful and give people information about that might be helpful for them. It could be in any part of the country, but these are some of the issues that you come up with in a rural area. So thanks again for listening. If you like the content, like and share, please. And I try to make a commitment here now to start making more videos at least once a week and update them and so on, because we're a community here. There's a lot of people like us out in the rural areas of the world here, especially in America, and it's a beautiful thing to live in the country. And I know that my viewers and my community really appreciate that. So thanks again for listening, and I hope to see you in some of my other videos and see my other content.